이제 기조 강연 순서로 이어가도록 하겠습니다. 네, OECD 지방재정분권국 이사벨 차트리 국장님의 기조 강연이 있겠습니다. 네, 국장님께서는 지역균형 발전을 위한 재정 분권화 최대한 활용하기라는 주제로 발표를 해 주실 건데요. So we have a keynote speech from Isabel Chatri, the head of unit of the Decentralization, Finance and Infrastructure at the OECD, to present fiscal decentralization for balanced regional development. So please give her a warm round of applause. 네, 여러분 큰 박수 부탁드리겠습니다.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So I would like to thank the Korean Institute of Local Finance and its partner, the Governor Association and the Association of Mayors, for inviting the OECD Center for Regions and Cities. And thank you also for this great opening ceremony. So as head of the unit responsible for carrying out the OECD work on decentralization, subnational finance and local infrastructure, it's a great honor to be here today with this assembly of eminent experts. In my presentation today, I will first provide a quick overview of the main regional inequalities trends across the OECD over the past 20 years. I will look at decentralization trends and focus on benefits, but also challenges of decentralization for regional development. In the third part, I will look at how to make fiscal decentralization beneficial to balance regional development and identify conditions that should be met for such positive outcomes. Then I will conclude and highlight some policy options moving forward. So let me start by highlighting key trends in regional inequalities across the OECD. Note that the insights that I will present today are not yet published, so it's a sneak preview, and they will be published this summer in our next regional outlook publication. So across the 38 OECD countries, we see a clear picture. There is a convergence of income level between countries, but a divergence within countries over the last 20 years. You can see on the graph how OECD economies have gone closer, it is the blue line, but also how inequality within countries, between regions and localities, have not decreased. It is the orange line. The trend is even more worried at the level of small regions, the so-called TL3 regions, which is the panel B on the right side of the graph. Overall, regional income inequality increased in 15 out of 27 OECD countries. And today, 70% of the population in the OECD, 70%, live in countries that experience increases in regional income inequality. Our next regional outlook shows that these diverging trends within countries are relatively recent and result from the deepening of globalization in the early 2000s, as well as the global financial crisis. They did not create equal opportunities for all and triggered a change of regime. More recently, the pandemic has also increased territorial disparities. But there is no single story of how regional inequalities have evolved across the OECD, but different trajectories. In fact, we can distinguish several groups of countries for which regional income inequality have increased or decreased. On the slide, they are classified according to their level of GDP per capita. And for example, regional income inequalities increased in countries such as the United Kingdom, France, the US, Belgium, Sweden, Japan, and Denmark. By contrast, they decreased in Norway, Germany, the Netherlands, Finland, and Austria, but also in countries with GDP converging to the OECD levels, such as New Zealand, Latvia, Korea, and Turkey. So why these different trajectories? From an economic perspective, the rise in regional income disparities is mainly explained by differences in labor productivity. But another major factor has been the steady concentration of people and opportunities in metropolitan regions, with an increasing gap with lagging regions. As these metro regions have been attracting more and more people in all OECD countries, except one, which is Greece, the disparities between metro and non-metro regions in terms of access to services like health, education, and broadband have grown tremendously. We saw this as it was a great issue in Korea this morning, but it is also a great issue in many, many OECD countries. So as you can see on the chart, across OECD and G20 countries, rural areas, these are the blue dots on the screen, are on average 31 percentage points below the national average in terms of download speed over fixed networks. This of course has important consequences in terms of business opportunities, investment attraction, work opportunities, and more generally, well-being. And these exemplify important inequalities in opportunities, which is what policymakers should focus on, opportunities. So not fixing these problems can result in significant economic, social, and political costs, and we are seeing how these costs can undermine trust and also our democracies. This can disrupt social cohesion and political stability, which, while making places more vulnerable to shocks, as shown by the pandemic. So the geography of discontent is making us all aware of the relevance of place-based policies and the need of more balanced regional development. This importance of place-based policies is even more relevant in the context of demographic changes and particular demographic decline. Many countries in the OECD are facing this issue, and in fact, by 2050, half of OECD regions are expected to experience population shrinkage. Rural regions, especially remote ones, have seen the highest increase in elderly dependency ratios in the past 2 decades. It was also mentioned as a key issue this morning in Korea. This unequal geography of population decline could impact regional inequalities in the future of many OECD countries if no measures are not taken, if no policy measures are not taken. So this leads me to my conclusion for this first part of my presentation. What are the policy options for reducing territorial inequalities? The first overarching answer is to adopt a place-based or territorial approach to all policies. A territorial lens should be given to public policies to first identify economic factors that tend to increase territorial disparities and then adopt corrective measures. Second, adopt more proactive or explicit measures that can reduce territorial disparities. They include measures to increase attractiveness and stimulate regional productivity catching up in lagging regions, but also measures to spark and sustain economic dynamism in performing regions. And at the OECD, we have identified 5 complementary policy levers to strengthen place-based policies that you can see on the slides. 2 are particularly relevant for our discussion of today. First, improve the quality of multi-level governance systems. And second, strengthen central and subnational strategic and fiscal capacity. So we can see the importance of subnational governance, regions and municipalities. They are the ones facing this discontent of their communities. They are also particularly well placed to act more effectively at the regional and local levels by identifying local comparative advantages and designing relevant development policies. But this implies that some national governments enjoy some autonomy and capacity to act. Thus, this also implies a certain level of decentralization. The issue of decentralization is clearly at the core of this policy roadmap, but decentralization is not a silver bullet, and on the contrary, it can be detrimental to balance regional development if it is not well designed and implemented. So in my second part, I would like to focus on decentralization trends in the OECD, its benefits, but also its challenges. But first, it's important to define decentralization, as decentralization is often understood in different ways. In particular, decentralization is often confused with deconcentration. Decentralization refers to the transfers of power, responsibilities, and resources from the central government level to elected authorities at the regional and/or local levels. Deconcentration is very different, although it can be very complementary to decentralization. It consists in displacing geographically the power from the central government based in the capital city to units based in regions that have no legal autonomy. So decentralization covers three interrelated dimensions: political decentralization, meaning the transfers of political powers to elected deliberative and executive authorities; administrative decentralization, in other words, the transfers of responsibilities from the central government to some national authorities in areas such as education, health, social protection, transport, etc. And finally, fiscal decentralization, that implies the transfers of financial resources to some national government. They have their own budget with some spending and revenue autonomy. In theory, these three dimensions are complementary and closely interconnected. In practice, finding the right balance between them represents major challenges to make the most of decentralization reform. I will come back to this. Decentralization reforms are implemented for a wide variety of political, historical, and economic reasons, which vary greatly across countries. To simplify, we can identify three main drivers for decentralization. First, some megatrends that are pushing for decentralization. They include, for example, urbanization, globalization, and digitalization that facilitates the shift towards decentralized governance practices. Political drivers are numerous, and they include local democracy, citizen participation, accountability, transparency, and also national stability, in particular in countries with strong regional identities, as decentralization can help integrate minorities and preserve regional identities. Finally, the economic drivers are also quite strong. A major motivation for decentralization is economic development and improved allocative efficiency for public services. I will come back to this also in a moment. So decentralization is a long-term trend in the OECD, but also globally, as shown by the OECD UCLG World Observatory on some national finance and investment, as well as by the work done by the Regional Authority Index and the Local Autonomy Index. More and more countries are conducting decentralization reforms around the world. You can see on the slides that 67% of 96 countries analyzed have experienced a net increase in the degree of regional authority over the long term, especially in Asia Pacific and in the OECD countries. At the local level, research also shows that the local autonomy increased in a majority of the 57 countries analyzed over the last 30 years, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. And as a result of these decentralization trends over the last decades, some national governments are playing an increasing economic and social role. In the OECD, some national government expenditure accounted for almost 40% of all public expenditure and 17% of GDP in 2020. You can see on the slides that the level of decentralization measured by the level of some national expenditure is particularly high in federal countries, such as Canada, Belgium, Germany, or Switzerland, but also in unitary countries, especially the Nordic countries, and Korea is also above the OECD average. Some national governments are also key public investors. In 2020, they are responsible for about 55% of total public investment and about 1.9% of GDP in the OECD on average. It is important, however, to put these figures I presented into perspective, as high level of expenditure or investment doesn't always mean a high level of autonomy. Some national governments may act as paying agents on behalf of the central government with little or no decision-making power, for example, in the education and health sector. So although not being a linear trend, decentralization is progressing. It is because decentralization can bring a number of potential economic and political benefits that you can see on the slide. I will focus only on those that are particularly relevant for regional development policy perspective. For example, decentralization that may facilitate tailoring services to local needs. Decentralization may improve the efficiency of public services delivery because some national governments have better information on local circumstances and conditions. Decentralization may also provide a platform for experimenting with public policies, conducting innovative approaches, including asymmetric decentralization that can reflect regional differences. Another benefit can be greater fiscal responsibility. In fact, spending and revenue autonomy of some national government can limit spending growth, which contributes to lower tax rates. As a result, there is a better use of public resources and spending effectiveness. There is also potentially a more efficient revenue collection thanks to a greater mobilization of local resources. Decentralization can also increase competition and accountability and therefore have a positive effect on the economic growth. Decentralization can improve regional convergence by helping lagging regions to catch up. And finally, decentralization can boost regional development, and in particular, regionalization may correct inter-regional disparities and give regional actors the means to implement better regional development policies. We have some data that show a positive correlation between decentralization and development. For example, based on the data of the World Observatory, we can see that there is a positive correlation between the level of some national expenditure and the level of GDP per capita. So you can see on the graph that most decentralized countries seem to have the highest GDP per capita, while the most centralized countries seem to have the lowest. Of course, this is not a general rule, and there are some counter-examples. And it is also important to stress that, as you know, correlation doesn't imply causation. But let's continue the exercise by looking at the correlation between spending decentralization and the Human Development Index. Here again, we can see a positive correlation between these two indicators at the global level. Now, if we compare decentralization and the Gini index that measures income inequality, we can see that across the world, higher some national expenditure as a percentage of GDP is correlated with lower inequality. This negative relationship is, however, not very strong, as there is a significant heterogeneity across and within income groups. In fact, the difficulty to analyze the outcomes of decentralization, especially on growth and regional development, is also related to the fact that decentralization policies are not always correctly designed and implemented. Many decentralization policies around the world have not led to expected results and have, in some cases, even worsened the situation of countries and territorial inequalities. In fact, decentralization policies can be challenging both on the economic and political sides. And challenges include, for example, benefits spillovers across jurisdictions, borders that can lead to under-provision of public services. There is also a risk of losing certain economies of scale and of fragmentation of public policies, a risk of clarity in the assignment of responsibilities with overlap and duplication. A weak fiscal decentralization can also result in unfunded mandates and lead to negative economic outcomes. Other challenges include a lack of coordination and alignment to national priorities, in particular for public investment, a lack of sufficient subnational capacities, and finally, the risk of destructive competition between jurisdictions and rising disparities across regions. So without solidarity tools and policy measures that strengthen the capacity of the poor regions, the benefits of decentralization may accrue only to the most developed and prosperous regions, resulting in an increase of disparities with lagging regions. So you will remember the three main components of decentralization I presented earlier: political, administrative, and fiscal. Very often, fiscal decentralization appears to be the weak or even missing link of decentralization policies in many countries around the world. Partial or incomplete decentralization without appropriate fiscal decentralization arrangements have often produced negative outcomes for regional development. So how to make the most of fiscal decentralization for balanced regional development? This is the topic of my last part. And it is to minimize the risks to enable the full benefits of decentralization that we have defined at the OECD 10 guidelines for effective and better decentralization. You can see them on the screen. So I will not describe all guidelines, but it is important to stress that they are all interdependent. If one dimension is missing, the overall decentralization framework can be affected. The first guideline focuses on the need for clarity in the assignment of responsibilities. In many countries, some national governments have key responsibilities, as you can see on the slide, which show the breakdown of some national expenditure by economic function. In the OECD, education represents the largest spending area, accounting for 22% of some national expenditure on average. It is followed by social protection, economic development, and health. Many of responsibilities are shared across levels of government, for example, in the education and health sectors. If the allocation of responsibilities between the national and some national levels, as well as between some national government levels themselves, if this is not clearly defined, this can lead to overlap and duplications. This seems pretty straightforward, but in many OECD countries, such clarity is lacking. Therefore, the way responsibilities are shared should be explicit, mutually understood, and clear for all actors at the central and some national levels. In addition, the way the functions are assigned within policy areas between financing, regulating, implementing, or monitoring should be also very clear. And finally, the way different responsibilities across policy areas are decentralized should be also balanced, so that some national government can design integrated regional development strategies that cover the most relevant policy area for regional development. Another important point is the need to strengthen the fiscal dimension of decentralization. Different empirical studies consistently show that revenue decentralization is more conducive to regional development than spending decentralization. Responsibilities are often transferred without sufficient transfers from the central government or sufficient capacity for some national government to raise their own revenues. Finance should then follow functions. Otherwise, unfunded mandates lie behind lower economic growth, and it can engender dysfunctionalities. You can see on the slide the breakdown of some national revenue by category. On average, grants and tax revenue represent each 42% of some national revenues, and user charges 13% in the OECD countries. But there is a great diversity across countries. In fact, in addition to providing sufficient resources, decentralization policies should also ensure that it provide adequate resources, meaning resources over which some national governments have some management authority, some autonomy. So beyond the quantity of revenues, there is also a quality dimension to revenues. This means in concrete terms that some national governments cannot be funded only through grants from the central government and share taxation. They also need to be able to rein on source revenues, including on-source taxes and user charges and fees, for which they are accountable. They need to have a balanced basket of revenues. You can see on the slide that the level of tax revenues amount to 7% of GDP and 32% of public tax revenue on average in the OECD. But the level of subnational tax is quite low in many OECD countries. And the level of own-source tax revenue, which is part of total tax revenue, or the level of autonomous taxes is even lower. With these two graphs on the slides, we look at the link between the regional GDP disparities and tax autonomy on one side, and vertical fiscal imbalances on the other side. Here again, you can see a correlation. It means that balanced fiscal structure, where local spending is mainly funded by local taxation, reduces regional disparities because it provides an incentive to better use local resources and implement policies that favor economic development. Another important condition to make multi-level governance work is to build adequate vertical coordination mechanisms between the central and national governments, including also good fiscal coordination mechanisms, such as sound fiscal rules for sustainability and more responsibility. It is also crucial to support horizontal cooperation between some national governments, in particular inter-municipal cooperation, to overcome the issue of fragmentation and provide better quality services and infrastructure at the right scale. Finally, it is key to support the strengthening of some national capacities, in particular administrative, technical, or strategic capacities, by implementing appropriate tools for building capacity, but also promoting learning by doing. These recommendations were also put, so I take this opportunity to show you this study this report that we published in 2021 on perspective on decentralization and rural-urban linkages in Korea, so where all these recommendations are also described. So my last slide before my conclusion is on fiscal tools that are specifically aimed at reducing regional disparities and boost regional development. They include equalization mechanisms, regional development funds, and tax incentives. I will focus on fiscal equalization mechanisms that are widely used in federal and unitary countries in the OECD to offset the negative consequences of decentralization. As I mentioned earlier, one major risk of decentralization is an increase of disparities between some national governments in terms of revenues and service provision. Therefore, decentralization should be accompanied by equalization mechanisms to both reduce differences in tax raising capacity and differences in the cost of providing public services. Therefore, arrangements based on both revenue equalization and charge equalization. And experience from the OECD countries show a variety of mechanisms, including vertical equalization based on vertical transfers from the central government to financially weak subnational governments, and horizontal transfers from wealthy subnational government to the poorer ones. And a recent OECD survey showed that fiscal equalization reduces revenue disparities by almost 2/3 in countries having such mechanisms. In countries like Australia or Germany, fiscal disparities are practically eradicated. But a reduction of fiscal disparities doesn't mean always a reduction of economic disparities across regions. So fiscal equalization policies are certainly necessary but are not sufficient, and they need to be complemented by more proactive and explicit measures for regional development. So to conclude, I would like to highlight a new OECD recommendation adopted by the Regional Development Policy Committee a few days ago. The recommendation provides a comprehensive policy framework to support the design and implementation of effective regional development policies. It rests on 10 complementary pillars that you can see on the slide. And there are two which are particularly important. Establishing some multi-level governance arrangements to foster coherent regional development policy, strengthening capacities, and the third one of mobilizing diversified, balanced, and sustainable financial resources, in particular at the subnational level. These are three core principles that should guide future regional development policies. So many thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much for that thorough presentation.